this year, I've really been getting into shooting anamorphic, specifically on the Blazar Remus 35mm, which I think in many ways is quite an overlooked budget anamorphic, especially if you compare it to other Blazar lenses, like the Blazar Remus 45mm and the 65mm, and also the Blazar Mantis. When I was looking up YouTube videos about the Blazar Remus 35mm, I didn't find a lot about it. If you compare that to the other Blazar Remus lenses, there was a lot more coverage around those lenses, which I do get why. I think the main reason is because the Blazar Remus 35mm is a S25 lens, so you have to use a APS-C crop sensor to shoot on it. But even though that's the case, I still want to make the case that the Blazar Remus 35mm might be the best budget anamorphic, especially if you consider price and image quality. So first off, the image quality. I think the lens just looks incredible. My favorite thing is that the camera has barrel distortion, which is kind of this fisheye effect that you're getting, where the lines at the outer side of the image bulges outward. So you get this like round fisheye effect, compared to other budget anamorphics, which often has pincushion distortion, which is opposite, where the lines goes inwards, which I think many people don't find as pleasing. And I think the barrel distortion is often what you'll find in more expensive anamorphic lenses. What I also like about this lens is that it has this radial blur, or blur vignetting, at the top and bottom, and also a little bit on the sides, where even if you're shooting infinity focus and doing wide shots, you're still getting this radial blur on top and bottom, which really gives this more vintage aesthetic even to, wide shots. And it really accentuates the anamorphic qualities. This is also a 1.5x lens. I'm now shooting on a 16:9 sensor. So when you stretch that image 1.5x, you're getting a 266:1 aspect ratio. You don't have to crop that much if you want a 239:1 delivery. It's quite a fast lens. You can shoot at T1.6. I usually don't do that. I usually shoot between T2 to T2.8. I think that's where it performs the best. I'm now shooting at T2, but most of the other footage I've been shooting has been at T2.8. And I think T2.8 might be the sweet spot, where everything that's in focus is relatively sharp, but you're still getting that nice anamorphic bokeh that you're looking for. It does have quite a lot of chromatic aberration, especially if you have it wide open. But I do also think that's part of the quality that I really like. I also find that the lens flares that comes from this lens is quite pleasing. And I also think that the 35mm is a great focal length if you're only buying one anamorphic lens, because you can still get these wide shots, but you can still get pleasing close-ups without it distorting the face too much, especially if you're shooting in the APS-C crop. And speaking of close-ups, it doesn't have an amazing minimum focus, but you can still get relatively close from the neck and up. You can get like a close-up of the face, but you can't get these like super macro shots of eyes and stuff like that. So that's something to consider. Then you might have to get a diopter to get like super close-ups. But for me, from what I've been making, I really haven't been needing that at all. I haven't used any diopters. I think the minimum focus is great from what I've been making, at least. I think it just has a great cinematic anamorphic look that really looks anamorphic compared to other budget anamorphics that might have too sterile or too clean of a look. So if you really want that anamorphic look, I think this is a great budget choice. Speaking a little bit about build quality, it feels very nice to use. It's not too heavy, but it's not light either. It's not made of plastic or something like that. It's probably made with aluminium or something like that. I'm not really too sure. But it feels really nice. It doesn't feel cheap. It's not too heavy that it's hard to work with, but it's also not so light that it feels cheap. And also, the focus throw is relatively long, and there's enough resistance where you won't knock the focus by mistake. And that's especially the case with the aperture ring. that has quite a lot of resistance. So it's pretty much impossible to knock the aperture by mistake. And I think my favorite thing about the lens is that it looks really nice. It looks really professional. I like the font. I like the color. You really feel professional using it. It doesn't feel like a toy. And I guess in a way it makes you feel more confident using it. And if you're on a set, it doesn't feel like you're using a budget anamorphic. It looks like the real deal, which I think can be quite important when using lenses, even though it might be more for the vanity's sake. It's still a important part of the whole package when you're using a lens. Then speaking of price, it's around $899 US. So if you compare that to other Blazar lenses, I think this might be on the cheaper end, at least if you compare it to the other Blazar Remuses, and especially the Blazar Kados and the Blazar Mantis. But I think from what you're getting, I think this is a really good deal. $899 isn't cheap by any means. But if you compare it to something like the Atlas lenses, which are still on the cheaper end when it comes to anamorphics, they cost around at least $5,000. You can buy at least 5 to 6 of these Blazar Remus 35mm lenses for one Atlas Mercury, for example. So that's something to consider when you're looking at this lens and looking at the image quality and the build quality, is also compared to the price. And I think for what you're getting, considering the price, I think it's an incredible lens. So this year, I've been using this lens a lot. Mainly, I've been taking it to vacation, just filming test videos outside and using it on YouTube videos. So I tested it quite extensively. But also this summer, I also shot a feature film with only this lens. And it was a very low budget feature film where I was the producer and DOP. And we used it outside in the forest for the most part with only natural light. And I think the way it renders out nature and the background, the lens gives a lot of character with the anamorphic bokeh and all the other vintage characteristics you're getting out of this lens. So it's kind of hard to explain, but just everything you shoot with this lens kind of just looks like a movie. And I think me and everybody else that was part of the film was very impressed and happy with the look that we got using this lens on the film. It should also be noted that this was a very low budget production with a very small crew. I was the only camera person, so I was the DOP and also the camera operator. So it's quite important that this was a lens that was light enough so that I could operate the camera for hours on end without getting tired. Because I was using it on a Lumix S5, just holding it handheld, without having an easy rig or anything like that. And it felt very sturdy, but it wasn't so heavy that I became too tired by the end of the day. So I thought I'd just show you this as well. Since this lens is a peel mount, I'm actually able to rotate the lens 90 degrees increments and still mount the lens. So I now rotate the lens 90 degrees, and instead of stretching the image horizontally, you're now stretching the image vertically. And what happens then is that you get a much taller image instead of getting a much wider image, while still retaining the anamorphic characteristics that you get from an anamorphic lens, but instead you get a very tall image. So this is something that I've really been enjoying shooting. And the great thing is, if you're shooting anamorphic mode, is that the iris is oval. So if you rotate it, it actually becomes much wider. So now it covers pretty much the whole sensor, especially if you do lens correction. Then you actually don't have to crop into the sensor at all. And if you don't have an Opagate sensor, this is actually a way to kind of achieve the same kind of look while still having this vintage anamorphic look, just rotated vertically. What I love about this look is that it doesn't quite look anamorphic, obviously, because it's much taller, but it really gives this trippy, very vintage kind of look. So if you want to shoot, let's say 4x3 or 1.2x1 or something like that, have a very tall image and don't want to crop the sensor, this might be a solution for you. And instead of having the radial blur on top or bottom, it's now on the sides. So it really accentuates the tall image. And even if you have infinity focus, there'll still be blur on the sides. And you also get this kind of fisheye look if you don't do the lens correction. If you want to do a music video or want to have a scene that looks quite trippy or have like a claustrophobic look, or maybe make a horror film that's more of like a period look, something like The Lighthouse, for example, this might be a great solution for you. And also the great thing about this, if you shoot in vertical anamorphic, is that when you're stretching horizontally, the rolling shutter kind of becomes worse because the line becomes even more skewed. But with this, it's actually the opposite. So with open gate, often you get a much worse readout speed. But with this, instead of getting a worse readout speed, you're actually getting a better readout speed, because if you imagine this skewed line, if you stretch it vertically, that line will become more straight. So that's also something to consider when deciding to shoot vertical anamorphic or not. And also speaking a little bit about the Lumix S5 and the Blazar Remus 35mm. So perhaps some of you might be turned off by buying a S35mm lens when you have something like the Lumix S5, which can shoot in full frame. The thing about the Lumix S5 in full frame mode is that it has quite a low readout speed at around 20 milliseconds. And what happens then, if you use an anamorphic lens, you're squeezing the image, or you're dragging out the image. And the rolling shutter artifacts often is shown through a, skewed line. So if you imagine you have a skewed line when whipping the camera back and forth with a low readout speed, if you stretch out the image, the line will become even more skewed. So the rolling shutter will become even more noticeable. So a lot of people will tell you you need a high readout speed to use anamorphics. But in a way, this lens kind of solves that, because this is a APS-C lens. And the Lumix S5 has a APS-C mode, which still shoots in 4K. And if you shoot in that mode, you actually halve the readout speed. So instead of 20 milliseconds, you get a 10 millisecond readout speed, which is actually a really good readout speed. So then, when you then squeeze the image, the rolling shutter won't be as noticeable. So if you're shooting with something like the Lumix S5, it might not necessarily be a bad idea shooting in APS-C mode and using S35 lenses. Another great thing about this lens and the Lumix S5 is that this is a 1.5x. So one of the problems about shooting anamorphic with the Lumix S5 is that it's a 16:9 sensor. It doesn't shoot open gate. So if you want to shoot something like 2x squeeze, you get a 3:1 aspect ratio, or even wider than that. And that's way too wide to actually, deliver a feature film or a project in. So you have to crop the image quite a bit. Since this is a 1.5x lens, you stretch it 1.5 times, and then you actually get a 2.66:1 aspect ratio, which I think is already a usable aspect ratio. But if you want 2.39:1 delivery, you only have to crop around 1.13 times or something like that. So speaking of full frame mode, I'm actually shooting in full frame mode right now in this talking head. I've been doing that the whole time. And even though this is a S35 sensor, you actually only have to crop around 1.3x if you're using the full frame mode. So even though it's meant for APS-C sensors, you can still get a lot out of it by shooting in full frame mode. And get a lot more out of it compared to shooting on APS-C mode. So even if you have full frame mode and want to shoot full frame, you're still able to use this lens, but you just have to crop a little bit, around 1.3x. Then you'll be getting to use the whole image circle of the lens. And actually, if you do lens correction in DaVinci Resolve and correct the barrel distortion, you only have to crop around 1.2x, which is quite nice. So even if you want to shoot full frame, this lens might still be usable for you. So who's this lens for? I think if you want to get into anamorphic shooting, and especially if you have a APS-C camera like the Sony FX30, I definitely think this is a great choice for your first anamorphic lens. But I also think this is a lens even for people shooting full frame mode, especially if you're willing to crop into the sensor a little bit. And also it's just a lens for people who want to have an image that stands out, and you want to kind of combat the sterile look you sometimes get from the digital image. And you kind of get this more filmic look, I think. So yeah, these were my opinions on the Blazar Remus 35mm. I hope you enjoyed, and yeah, see you later.